So, David Drucker, let's talk about we had the Treasury Secretary on earlier this morning, talked about this China deal. He'd actually set expectations fairly low at the beginning of the weekend, saying he didn't know if they were going to be able to get to a deal. They, in fact, have got to a 90-day pause. I'm curious, does this play in line with what the Trump administration has been expecting all along? Again, set up tough goals, tough standards, and hopefully move the Chinese to a concession here.
It's unclear, Joe. I mean, we could end up where the administration wanted to be, which was to break down Chinese tariffs, make it easier for the U.S. to export to China and to deal with this fentanyl crisis that the administration blames China for, and that China does have a lot of culpability for. But again, we're in a situation where we have a framework of a deal, but no deal. We have a pause, but no conclusion in negotiations. So it's definitely a more positive environment, and we're in a much better place than we were at the beginning of the trade action instigated by the president. But we just don't know where this is going to end up. And we, continue to hear different messages from the administration, and maybe that's the way they want it. On the one hand, you'll listen to Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent, talk about the fact that the U.S. does want trade. They just want it more balanced. And then you will hear often Trump and some others around him talk about the fact that we don't really need trade, that if we don't trade, the country saves money, and that the point is to reshore manufacturing that has been offshored to China and other Asian nations. So I just think this continues to be fluid, although clearly from an investment perspective, and if you're an American business that depends on Chinese imports, today is a much better day for you than yesterday.
A much better day. Jonathan Martin, you look at Wall Street, obviously those numbers are going up. I've always found it interesting that you can talk to, whether you're talking about Wall Street CEOs or economists, you can talk to people who have been the fiercest free trade advocates through the years. And even they will say, China's screwing us. China's taking advantage of us. I hear it all the time. I'm sure you hear it all the time, too. And I'm not talking about like right now. I'm talking about this is something I've heard over the past decade. I'm for free trade, but ... And then they'll say, China really has to come to the table because they're screwing us right now. So I'm curious your reaction to what the Treasury Secretary's announced and how tough it's going to be getting to where the Trump administration wants to get to have a trade deal that rebalances what many business owners think is an unbalanced trade system against the U.S.
Well, let's start with the palace intrigue part of this. Scott Bessent obviously has now taken the lead, Joe, over Peter Navarro and the internal jockeying. Look, Peter Navarro said last month that the tariffs were here to stay. This was not leverage. This was set policy. That has proven to be emphatically untrue. Look at last week. We did a deal with the Brits, and now the framework to bring down tariffs with the Chinese, navigated by Scott Bessent. That's why the markets are reacting, Joe, like they are, because this is bigger than just a Chinese deal. This says that the tariffs are not here to stay. This is the opening bid for negotiations. That's number one.
Right.
Number two, Joe, you're absolutely right, though, on the Chinese piece of this. In fact, some could argue that the biggest dove left in American politics on China is Donald Trump himself, because Trump so eagerly wants to do big deals with, other countries, whether on security or trade. But for years, certainly in the Biden era, Joe, there was a bipartisan consensus toward, a hard line on China, especially on the security front, but also increasingly on the trade front. And I think that is now more in question because you have a president who is eager to do, as he calls them, big, beautiful deals, no matter who the interlocutor is.
Well, here's Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent on with us earlier this morning talking about where things go from here with China.
Well, Joe, this is going to go where the president wants it to go. I was in touch with him over the weekend, and he wants free trade, free and fair trade. We've had free trade, and as you said, that has not worked for the American people. There's something called the China shock, which has gutted our manufacturing sector. And China has a different form of government for us. They have a different economic model where they subsidize labor, they subsidize capital goods, and they have exported that to us and the rest of the world. We have put up tariffs to push back on that, so it will be a matter of what is the equilibrium level on tariffs and also getting China to open their markets for American companies.
Let's bring in right now the co-anchor of CNBC Squawk Box and New York Times columnist, Andrew Ross-Okun. Andrew, there's what I was trying to talk about on Friday. May not have been as articulate as I wanted to be, but the U.S.-UK trade deal, that, again, the outlines of the deal that a lot of people were kind of digging through all the details on. I saw that as a positive deal, especially because it's with a country we have a special relationship with. But I thought it suggested that we may be moving now into the second phase. The first phase was Donald Trump setting these high numbers for negotiations. The second phase may be now using that leverage to get deals. Looks like Wall Street likes what they're hearing so far this morning. What's your reporting tell you?
Look, I think Wall Street loves what they're hearing, in part because the expectation of these massive tariffs seem to be coming down, and it seems to be ultimately not going to be the strategy of the United States to pursue them. We will see ultimately what that looks like. But as you know, just I think it was Friday, President Trump was talking about 80% tariffs on China. Now we're talking effectively about 30%, this 10% plus this 20% related to fentanyl. And maybe that's a negotiating tool to get them down ultimately to 10%. So I think that for the global economy and for the markets, if this is in fact a reset, this is a very, very good thing. I think there is a question mark, of course, as to what that ultimately means to some of the other goals that the administration has laid out around bringing revenue into the United States in the form of tariffs, how that will affect tax policy and budgets and the like, given that actually if you bring the rates down, of course, you won't be collecting that revenue. And so you're going to have to try to make up the taxes and make the budget in a different way. There's a question mark about bringing back manufacturing to the United States. If, in fact, these tariffs were going to be super high, that actually might have been an argument for certain companies to come back to the United States. If they're super low or they're non-existent, that may not happen. So I think there's just, and this is why there's been so many different cross currents and also different almost factions inside the White House. You know, you just talked about the Navarro camp versus the Bessent camp. Clearly, right now, the Bessent camp is winning, and the markets and this economy, and I imagine many global leaders like the Bessent camp better.
You know, Jonathan Lemire, it's so important that people don't overread. Well, they can do what they want to do, but if they want to understand what's going on inside the White House, it's important not to overread and break too much in one direction, where last week before the UK deal and before the China deal, it was the sky is falling and we're going to have massive tariffs on every country forever. Now we have a couple of possibilities, outlines of deals, or sort of an economic ceasefire with China. And now we're hearing, oh, Donald Trump's backing off. He's blinking. He's on retreat. All my reporting from people close to Donald Trump over the weekend was he has believed in tariffs since 1987. He continues to believe in tariffs, and he still thinks that's the best way forward, just not at the high rates where he started with, again, what I still believe were his opening bids.
Yeah, that's certainly been one of the schools of thought here, is that this is all part of negotiations. This is the art of the deal, if you will. And that Trump, no doubt, firmly believes in tariffs. There aren't many things that he has been ideologically consistent about. Tariffs, clearly one of them. But, Andrew, you raised a good point, though, that their tariffs were supposed to have all these benefits, including paying for the huge tax cut that Republicans want to pass. If that revenue is gone, That's a real issue and makes life on Capitol Hill that much harder. But talk to us also, even if it's not a blink, even if it's just part of negotiations, we can assess it any way you want. But that's true for perhaps how the White House is viewing it. But what about the rest of the world? Just the topsy-turviness of the last 6 weeks since so-called Liberation Day that has really undermined faith and confidence in the United States around the globe. Are the countries and businesses going to feel that much more comfortable investing in the United States?
Well, look, I think that the argument that the administration would make, and I think that they're right long term, and there's a complicated question shorter term, which is, we still are a great investment. In a relative world, in terms of where you can put your money, the U.S. may ultimately be the best place to put it. The question is whether, if you think that there's a distrust or an upset, if you will, and we've seen that in the context of travel from Canada and other places, there can be short-term hits, and there can be a sense that that trust is lost. And in the short term, I think there is an argument to be made that it could affect things. Having said that, all of the soft numbers, this is what economists look at, they call the hard numbers or the soft numbers. The soft numbers indicate that the economy should be softening. The hard numbers that hasn't happened yet. We've all been looking and waiting for this moment to happen, this inflection point, and everybody says, well, maybe it's going to happen in June, maybe it's going to happen in July. And by the way, it very well may. And so I think we're going to have to look for that. You know, you talk to CEOs, they talk about their own paralysis, but again, it hasn't shown up in the numbers yet. And that's why the markets are basically, it's almost like a time machine. The markets are where they were basically before Liberation Day.